Chapter 3 of By What Authority? By Robert Hugh Benson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. London Town. Isabel's visit to London, which had been arranged to take place the Christmas after Anthony's departure to Cambridge, was full of bewildering experiences to her. Mr. Norris from time to time had references to look up in London, and divines to consult as to difficult points in his book on the Eucharist, and this was a favourable opportunity to see Mr. Deering, the St. Paul's lecturer. So the two took the opportunity, and with a couple of servants drove up to the city one day early in December, to the house of Alderman Merritt, the wool merchant, and a friend of Mr. Norris's father, and for several days, both before and after Anthony's arrival from Cambridge, went every afternoon to see the sights, the maze of narrow streets, of high black and white houses, with their ironwork signs, leaning forward as if to whisper to one another, leaving strips of sky overhead, the strange play of lights and shades after nightfall, the fantastic groups, the incessant roar and rumble of the crowded alleys. All the commonplace life of London was like an enchanted picture to her, opening a glimpse into an existence of which she had known nothing. To live, too, in the whirl of news that poured in day after day, borne by splashed riders and panting horses, this was very different to the slow round of country life, with rumours and tales floating in, mellowed by doubt and lapse of time, like pensive echoes from another world. For example, morning by morning, as she came downstairs to dinner, there was the ruddy-faced alderman with his fresh budget of news of the north. Lords Northumberland and Westmoreland, with a Catholic force of several thousands, among which were two cousins of Mrs. Merritt herself, and the old lady nodded her head dolorously in corroboration, had marched southwards under the banner of the Five Wounds, and tramped through Durham city, welcomed by hundreds. The cathedral had been entered, old Richard Norton with the banner leading. The new communion table had been cast out of doors, the English Bible and prayer book torn to shreds, the old altar reverently carried in from the rubbish heap, the tapers rekindled, and amid hysterical enthusiasm Mass had been said once more in the old sanctuary. Then they had moved south. Lord Sussex was powerless in York, the Queen terrified and irresolute, alternately storming and crying. Spain was about to send ships to Hartlepool to help the rebels. Mary Stuart would certainly be rescued from her prison at Tutbury. Then Mary had been moved to Coventry. Then came a last flare of frightening tales. York had fallen. Mary had escaped. Elizabeth was preparing to flee. And then one morning the alderman's face was brighter. It was all a lie, he said. The revolt had crumbled away. My Lord Sussex was impregnably fortified in York with guns from Hull. Lord Pembroke was gathering forces at Windsor. Lords Clinton, Hereford, and Warwick were converging towards York to relieve the siege. And as if to show Isabel it was not a mere romance, she could see the actual train bands go by up Cheapside, with the gleam of steel caps and pike heads, and the mighty tramp of disciplined feet, and the welcoming roar of the swarming crowds. Then, as men's hearts grew lighter, the tale of chastisement began to be told, and was not finished till long after Isabel was home again. Green after green of the windy northern villages was made hideous by the hanging bodies of the natives, and children hid their faces and ran by, lest they should see what her Grace had done to their father. In spite of the holy sacrifice, and the piteous banner, and the call to fight for the faith, the Catholics had hung back and hesitated, and the catastrophe was complete. The religion of London, too, was a revelation to this country girl. She went one Sunday to St. Paul's Cathedral, pausing with her father before they went in to see the new restorations, and the truncated steeple struck by lightning 8 years before, which, in spite of the Queen's angry urging, the citizens had never been able to replace. There was a good congregation at the early morning prayer, and the organs and the singing were to Isabel as the harps and choirs of heaven. The canticles were sung to shepherd's setting by the men and children of St. Paul's, all in surplices, and the dignitaries wore besides their grey fur almuces, which had not yet been abolished. The grace and dignity of the whole service, though to older people who remembered the unreformed worship a bare and miserable affair, and to Mr. Norris, with his sincere simplicity and spirituality, a somewhat elaborate and sensuous mode of honouring God, yet to Isabel was a first glimpse of what the mystery of worship meant. The dim towering arches, through which the dusty, richly stained sunbeams poured, the far-away murmurous melodies that floated down from the glimmering choir, the high thin pealing organ, all combined to give her a sense of the unfathomable depths of the divine majesty, an element that was lacking in the clear-cut personal Puritan creed, in spite of the tender associations that made it fragrant for her, and the love of the Saviour that enlightened and warmed it. The sight of the crowds outside, too, in the frosty sunlight, gathered round the grey stone pulpit on the north east of the cathedral, and streaming down every alley and lane, the packed galleries, the gesticulating black figure of the preacher. This impressed on her an idea of the power of corporate religion that hours at her own prayer desk, or solitary twilight walks under the hall pines, or the uneventful divisions of the rector's village sermons had failed to give. It was this Sunday in London that awakened her quiet soul from the lonely companionship of God to the knowledge of that vast spiritual world of men of which she was but one tiny cell. Her father observed her quietly and interestedly as they went home together, but said nothing beyond an indifferent word or two. He was beginning to realise the serious reality of her spiritual life, and to dread anything that would even approximate to coming between her soul and her Saviour. The father and daughter understood one another, and were content to be silent together. Her talks with Mrs. Merritt, too, left their traces on her mind. The alderman's wife, for the first time in her life, found her views and reminiscences listened to as if they were oracles, and she needed little encouragement to pour them out in profusion. She was especially generous with her tales of portents and warnings, and the girl was more than once considerably alarmed by what she heard, while the ladies were alone in the dim firelit parlour on the winter afternoons before the candles were brought in. "When you were a little child, my dear," began the old lady one day, "there was a great burning made everywhere of all the popish images and vestments, all but the copes and the altar cloths that they made into dresses for the ministers' new wives, and bed quilts to cover them, and there were books and banners and sepulchres and even relics. I went out to see the burning at Paul's, and though I knew it was proper that the old papistry should go, yet I was uneasy at the way it was done. Well," went on the old lady, glancing about her, "I was sitting in this very room only a few days after, and the air began to grow dark and heavy, and all became still. There had been 2 or 3 cocks crowing and answering one another down by the river, and others at a distance, and they all ceased. And there had been birds chirping on the roof, and they ceased. And it grew so dark that I laid down my needle and went to the window, and there at the end of the street over the houses there was coming a great cloud with wings like a hawk, I thought. But some said afterwards that when they saw it, it had fingers like a man's hand, and others said it was like a great tower with battlements. However that may be, it grew nearer and larger, and it was blue and dark, like that curtain there, and there was no wind to stir it, for the windows had ceased rattling, and the dust was quiet in the streets. And still it came on quickly, growing as it came, And then there came a far-away sound like a heavy wagon, or some said like a deep voice complaining, and I turned away from the window afraid, and there was the cat that had been on a chair down in the corner with her back up, staring at the cloud, and then she began to run around the room like a mad thing, and presently whisked out of the door when I opened it. And I went to find Mr. Merritt, and he had not come in, and all the yard was quiet. I could only hear a horse stamp once or twice in the stable, and then I was calling out for someone to come. The storm broke, and the sky was all one dark cloud from side to side. For 3 hours it went on, rolling and clapping, and the lightning came in through the window that I had darkened, and through the clothes over my head, for I had gone to my bed and rolled myself round under the clothes. And so it went on. And my dear," and Mrs. Merritt put her head close to Isabel's, "I prayed to Our Lady and the saints, which I had not done since